Are you a lover and a player of D&D and other TTRPGs and you just love them so much and you either want to run these games or you already do, but the one thing is like what does running a TTRPG mean? What does being the game master or the dungeon master or the keeper mean? What is your role when it comes to these games, and what is your responsibilities when you play them, and what isn't your responsibility when you play them? That is exactly what we are going to be discussing on today's episode of the RPG Goblin, is the role of the game master, which I am really excited about because I bring on Zakariah and we just have a conversation about what other people's views of the game master are. What is his interpretation of what the role of the game master is? How he uses that in his own games and how it changes the way he preps and runs the game, and how simple is always better. Like, it's all kinds of different things. And if you haven't run a TTRPG game yet and you really want to, I highly recommend listening to this episode, at least to see what is the framework of being a game master. And even if you already run these games, I still recommend you listen to this episode because if anything, you can come out of it with ideas and inspiration of what does it mean for me to be the game master? So if that sounds all fine and dandy and like an absolutely fantastic time, which it is, let's get into the episode. Welcome, everyone, to the RPG Goblin, a TTRPG podcast that makes learning and exploring these games fun and easy, along with we talk about cool TTRPG things in general. Like, today's episode is going to be about the role of the GM, which I will talk about in just a moment, because first I do have to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Willow, and I am the host of the RPG Goblin. I am the resident goblin and the one who asks all the questions because I love these games and I'm just endlessly curious and won't stop talking. And like I said, today's episode, we are going to be talking about the role of the GM. Also, like, why the GM, where the GM, who the GM, all of the questions involving the GM and Game Master today. We will probably shift between using GM and DM while we're talking about this, just because both of them are very common ways to say that. And in today's episode, we have on the amazing guest of Zakariah. Zakariah has been on a few times already, and it's been a pleasure every single time. And so I'm very excited to have him on again and talk about the role of the GM. And so, Zakariah, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone, telling people who you are, where they can find things that you do, and so forth?
Yeah, hi, I am Zakariah. I am a dungeon master, and I have been into these games for years at this point, played thousands of hours of this game, various tabletop games, actually. And I also like to create content for other people's games, because when I am not running my own games, I'm generating content that I would like to play at some point. And so I take all the things that don't really fit into my game, or even things that I've recently run, and I condense it and I put it onto DMsGuild. So if you look up Zakariah in the search bar on DMsGuild, you'll see a list of all 49 packets I've published onto DMsGuild at this point, which was very exciting to see.
That's so much. Good job.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's ZAKARIAH on DMsGuild, and it'll populate all of the results that are tagged with me as the author.
Perfect. That's amazing. And I have gotten some of this content myself, and it is fantastic. So I can recommend. And I will have a link as well to Zakariah's DMsGuild in the description of this episode too, if you want to quickly find that as well. But yeah, so we are going to be talking about the role of the GM today, which is something I'm very excited about because I remember this came from, I know we were talking like, yeah, we need to do another episode, and you sent like this whole list. And I remember specifically the role of the GM popping out as like, oh, that seems like a really interesting topic to bring on and talk about. And so I'm curious of why that was something that popped up in your mind to talk about.
I think it's one of those things that when you're first starting out, you don't really question, because it's like, okay, I'm playing a tabletop game for the first time. There's always a DM or a game master or a storyteller just written into the rules. But I think that if you actually like were to consider what the job of the DM is, I think that that can assist you in doing a better job. It's almost like if you're going in for a position at a company and they don't outline what your responsibilities are and they just say go, like you can infer what your responsibilities are,
Uh-huh.
but you can excel at them if you actually know clearly what you're supposed to be doing. And it turns
I love
out
that.
and it turns out for the DM role in particular, there's a lot of different ideas of what the role of the DM is supposed to be. So I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good way to describe it. You know, you don't know what job you're getting into until you start playing, and then you realize, hey, this has a lot of responsibilities attached.
Mhm.
And so I think that's why some people do feel like they kind of get stuck in the role of being a GM, which is unfortunate because you should never feel like you're stuck in any particular role when you're playing these games because you're all supposed to be having fun.
Well, I think it's also one of the things that is, and maybe we'll circle back to this in more detail later, but it's one of the things that is sort of like for new, for new players or people who want to be the DM at their table. Why they don't want to do it is because they don't think they can, or they don't
Hmm.
feel like they're not equipped to do it. And I think a
Hmm.
good chunk of that comes from not knowing what their job is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, am I supposed to know every single rule of the game? Am I
Mhm.
supposed to have like a ton? How much prep work beforehand is enough to get started? All of those sorts of like practical things that, you know, more experienced DMs have their own like routines and tips and
Mhm.
tricks and things that they picked up through um, like tribal knowledge about what it
Mhm.
takes to be a DM. When you don't have that tribal knowledge yet, it can seem like this hugely intimidating thing to become the DM, the person who's quote unquote in charge of the game. But I mean, I would even say that that's a contentious thing to say. It's
Yeah.
like, are you in charge of the game? Um,
I
but
mean, you're
but
playing with your friends. Like, I'd hope that not one person's in charge.
yeah, but you know, to what degree does responsibility
Mhm.
fall upon you versus other people? I think that that can be intimidating for a lot of people before they start out, and you need in some of these games, you kind of need somebody to take on the responsibilities of the DM,
Mhm.
um, just to facilitate the game. And if no one's willing to do it, well, you don't have a game. So I think if
Yeah.
if you can start off with a clear idea of what are your jobs as a DM and you know how much responsibility is yours versus the rest of your players, I
Mhm.
think that that can be like a good first step of like, yeah, you can do this. Because
Yeah.
I genuinely think that, you know, there well, I don't think there is a deficit of DMs versus players, right? Like
Mhm.
there's absolutely way more people who want to play but can't because they don't have a DM to run their game. So
Mhm.
what you need to do is you need to make more DMs.
You create more. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I agree with that because most people, if you look at posts where it's like I'm looking for a game, it's usually a player, and most people don't want to take up that role of a GM because, like you said, it is scary and you don't really know what your job is, and you need that experience and all of that, which is just really interesting. That's how all of the culture seems to go in the direction of, and always making the GM's job seem really, really complicated when that's also lot of the time up to personal preference of how you want to play your games. You don't need to have like 10 pages of prep done before every single session to be a good GM. And so I think a lot of people get it in like think that, oh, to be a GM, I have to be able to write an entire world and story that then ties in with a grand world where there's all kinds of little moving parts. So then I have 10 pages of prep every session and every NPC is diverse and interesting and all of these things when that is such an insane that's such an
Yeah.
insane way to look at that role because that's not what it is most of the time. Like yeah, you these might be goals that you want to accomplish, but right off the bat that's usually not the kind of game that you're going to be running because you're still learning.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that there's definitely also like DMing styles
Hmm.
that you could pick up one versus another. There's also the amount of prep. I'm just going to make a note of that for later. Amount of prep, because there are some very good resources about both of those things of like, what is your DMing style as far as preparation, and also what amount of prep is sufficient in order to actually just sit down and play the game.
Yep.
Just in case anybody who is listening to this has like questions about like, because your preference seems to be for GM, I tend to say DM. That does kind of have to do with I guess more of just like the introduction to the tabletop role-playing game space that each of us have had, and personal preference, right? But
sure.
So Dungeon Master is DM. That comes from Dungeons and Dragons, which has dungeons in it, typically as a mechanic of the game. And even if it doesn't have a literal dungeon in it, it mechanically has a space which is hostile, wherein the adventurers have to delve into. Therefore, a dungeon, even if it takes the form of a forest or a sky castle, right? Like, it's still a dungeon in that game. Where Game Master is a little bit more general purpose, because Dungeon Master is copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast. So Game Master is the more like general term, but you can also infer by the title that Game Master is also covering a lot more ground than Dungeon Master, right? Like your game may not have dungeons. Your game might have mechanics that are entirely narrative based. Game Master is kind of a catch-all for it and is probably more accurate. I'm still gonna say DM because it's what falls out of my face, but I will acknowledge that like there is actually more accuracy to Game Master, but of course there's a billion titles for this role in different games.
Oh my lord, there are so many. It's like storyteller and keeper, then there's like keeper of mysteries and gosh, there's like, what was the one? It's like a castle. There's a million titles in Castle Keeper is another one I know.
Yeah. There's so many, and the gist of it is that you can kind of infer sort of the like implied role of the DM in that game, at least from the intention of the game designers, from what they decide to call their GM, right?
Yes.
But all in all, it is a very similar role, and I think that fundamentally there are some things in common between all of them that you could condense down the role of the DM into, a couple of distinct features that they all share. Because whether you're playing Vampire the Masquerade or you're playing Call of Cthulhu or you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, like there's some things that person being there is going to be doing.
Absolutely. And these are kind of, I guess, the core roles of the game master. And so I'm curious in the way that you said that, I feel like you may have some that you would like to give as examples.
I have opinions. I have strong opinions. You've brought opinions to your podcast. So I want to actually kind of start by segueing in with a little bit of just like I've heard multiple good examples, relatively good examples of what the role of a DM is. And I once heard it described as you're the rules arbiter, you're the world builder, and you're the villain. And before I get to what I feel about what I feel the responsibility of the DM is, I did kind of want to go on a bit of a side tangent about the GM as the role of the villain, because I hear this and I see it a lot, and I think it's a bad take. So I want to climb on a soapbox for a second and explain.
Absolutely.
Well, because I think that there is like this idea of like, oh, well, you've created the villain of the game, right? Like whatever antagonistic force there is in your game that your players have to solve or defeat, like you're responsible because you are the villain. But I
Mhm.
think that putting it on the GM that they are the villain is, I think that the way that that is phrased makes it sound like the GM has the same job as the villain, and I wouldn't
Mhm.
describe the author of a book as being the villain of the book.
Yeah.
Like
Be-
I wouldn't characterize the author as villain. And so
mhm.
I wouldn't characterize the GM as villain. You created them, but you created them with different intentions from them, because like your
Yeah.
villain's intentions are to, you know, grab the MacGuffin and destroy the world, right?
Mhm.
The GM's goal are directly counter to that, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to defeat the villain as well. You're trying to get your
Yeah.
players into the position to defeat them. So you can't align your goals between GM and villain because they are fundamentally opposed. You want your villain to lose.
Yeah, the whole thing is that you're leading the way for your players. You are all working together for the same goal of finishing this arc, this story, whatever, which is usually defeating a villain.
Mhm.
And to just say that, yeah, no, the GM's just the villain is really
I,
it's nothing.
Well, yeah, it's a collaborative game. Like I think
Mhm.
fundamentally tabletop role-playing games are collaborative storytelling, and
Yes.
the collaborative element of that kind of requires that there is a villain, but your DM is not the villain. And so you know, I have heard this from more than one like DM that I respect, that
Mhm.
they are the villain. And
Mhm.
I think it's not the best way to characterize it, because while you do generate villains, I mean, you're a villain churning machine, right? As the person running the game, you crank out new villains every week.
Mhm.
But that is not your job.
Yeah.
Yes, you do have to decide what the villain is doing, but again, like the author of a book writing down a villain, it's like, well, I don't think that the author is the villain of their story. I don't think
Mhm.
Stephen King is it, right? Like the character of Pennywise is a character that was created by the author as an antagonist for a story. And I think that
Exactly.
DM falls a little bit closer to that.
Exactly. And I would like to say as well, kind of thinking of the game master as the villain as well, with it being a collaborative game, it makes it so that there's kind of tension between the players and the GM if you view them
Mhm.
that way. Like, oh, they're the villain, they're trying to ruin my life. They're trying to ruin my
Yeah.
character's life. Like they are out to get us versus no, we're all just telling a story together. When conflicts happen and obstacles arise, that's just because that's how a story works,
Well,
not
and I do
because they're out to get you.
Yeah, and I do think that there is a long and healthy tradition in tabletop role playing games of DM as antagonist,
Mhm.
and having an antagonistic DM. But I
Mhm.
think that it boils down to all of those stories are, at least in a modern sense, viewed negatively.
Mhm.
Even if there is like a strong history of like convention play where you'd be playing with a DM and their primary goal would be to kill you.
Mhm.
And it's actually a good point brought up by the module of Tomb of Horrors.
Ooh.
Is actually so when Gary Gygax created Tomb of Horrors, sort of the goal of that module was to express to his players that they are not invincible,
Mhm.
because, and I mean, this is obvious when you say it, but it's like if the DM running the game wants your character dead, they're going to die.
Yeah.
Like if that is the goal, then you lose.
Mhm.
So as an example of that, there's this sort of like, death trap riddled, super unfair, quote unquote, dungeon that was created as an example of, if you think that your character is like unkillable, it's because the DM is letting it be unkillable. If you
Mhm.
think that your character is getting screwed over, it is because the DM is 100% trying to screw you over, right?
Mhm.
Like, like if you find yourself in an impossible situation, the DM presented an impossible scenario to
Yeah.
you, perhaps.
And those aren't
But it,
necessarily bad things to do because there are points in stories where there are impossible situations and things like that.
yeah,
That just
oh
shouldn't be the
yeah,
entire story. Like it shouldn't all be
yeah.
impossible like
Well,
against your players.
Well, also, I mean, I think in a very clever fashion, there is no impossible scenario in Tomb of Horrors either. It
Mhm.
seems impossible. It seems very unfair, but there is actually a way to get through it.
Oh,
Like
there is. I've
hundreds
heard
of
many
people
people
have
talk about
completed
it.
it. Like thousands of people have completed the Tomb of Horrors. So
Mhm.
it feels super impossible and unfair and is absolutely designed to challenge very high level players, but
It was designed
it
that way.
yeah, it is designed to make a point.
Mhm.
And it and honestly, I mean, to that effect, Gygax was a bit of a petty DM. From everything that I've grown to understand, like using the game as a way to exemplify certain behaviors or
Yeah.
disincentivize other behaviors was absolutely on the table. The dude was definitely more of an antagonistic DM than I think anybody in the space today would be okay with.
Yeah. And I mean like of course there's always it's all dependent on the games that you want to play. If you do want to play
Hmm.
games that have more of an antagonistic DM, then you know that's for you and your group to decide
Yeah.
if that is something that you would
I
like. And
I
so,
don't think it's that healthy for the space overall, though,
yeah, no,
to
absolutely not.
introduce that or introduce somebody to the game with that attitude. Like if
Mm-mm.
that's what you prefer to play, I think that introducing people to a more collaborative space is important. It's sort
Yep.
of like why I wouldn't start off playing a game that has a ton of homebrew rules first
Hmm.
introducing somebody to the space. It's like you'll probably want to play a game closer to rules as written when you're starting out for the same reason that you would probably want to be a positive collaborative experience because
Yep.
you're introducing somebody new and you want them to come back. So you should be a
Exactly.
good example.
And keep it just like easy and basic too. Like
Hmm.
that's such a good way to introduce people to the space because they get a taste of the game and then they get comfortable with the game before like they need to be comfortable before they can really start to branch out
Yeah.
and be like, "Oh man, it would be really interesting to be like someone that might be against the party." Like that's something
Hmm.
insanely tricky to do, and that's why that's at least I've seen several times people will never let a player play that kind of role unless they have years of experience of playing these types of games.
Yeah, because
Like,
I think that
yeah.
there's definitely like a line to walk there
Mhm.
as far as like doing it well and doing it in a way that isn't disruptive and antagonistic. Because
Yeah.
again, like it's a collaborative game.
And that's fun for everyone because with that kind of role as well, you have to still work with the party.
Hmm.
You just have to do it in a way. It's just such a tightrope to walk on. It's so
Oh,
interesting, but
I would kind of say that that is exactly along the lines of any character in any game
oh,
that
for
is
sure.
slow to trust people.
Hmm.
I think that that kind of falls into the same category of like, I don't think if you're a new player that you should play a character that is slow to trust
Or
because
that's like
doing
really
that,
edgy, or like a loner type, anything like that.
yeah, because I think that if you're playing somebody who's like, well, I have difficulty trusting people, it's like, well, I think that that's difficult to do in a collaborative setting.
Hmm.
Not impossible by all means. There are probably thousands of examples of characters from popular TV shows and other media that you could point to and be like, ah, but look at this character. They're slow to trust and they're sort of a loner type. And
Hmm.
it's like, and I love those characters, but I will
Hmm.
say that in a collaborative game, as your introduction, I think it's a lot harder to know when to bend as
Yep.
that kind of character because it's like, well, you still have to go somewhere with the rest of the party, otherwise there's no game.
Yeah.
The game stops at the tavern. Everybody meets, but one person's left behind, and then they can just go. I don't know. They can go bartend or something for the rest of the session.
Yeah. No, it's rough, but I again, this is where it's we definitely don't get off topic on this show.
Yeah, no.
So I'd like to then talk about kind of one of the other roles that you introduced, which is the rule Oh shit, what word did you use?
Oh, I had said rule arbiter because
Yeah, rule
yeah.
arbiter.
Yeah, I've heard it condensed on a number of occasions as like rule arbiter, a world builder, and the villain. And
Mhm,
I think that I can actually say I would condense world builder and villain into one role, and then I would separate the other role of rules arbiter as referee.
mhm.
So I guess that I can kind of go into what my idea is of the role of the DM then.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, go into that. I'm very curious.
so the way that I see the roles of the DM is I see the DM has two major roles at the table.
Mhm,
The first is as referee.
mhm,
And that's because the history of the DM is the history of the referee. Back before tabletop RPGs sort of spawned out of wargaming.
mhm,
If anybody listening is familiar with like Warhammer 40K or just like large scale battle things, or imagine like somebody in their basement with a bunch of like miniatures of like a Civil War reenactment, and they're like playing around with the Battle of Gettysburg, or they're playing with, D-Day and World War II models and stuff like that. Like that is sort of the like history of tabletop games before tabletop role-playing games existed.
mhm,
Um, and if you're playing a game like a war game and you have two players, for example, and you have two opposing armies and you've changed their positioning for the Battle of Waterloo or whatever, right? Like
mhm,
who decides what strategies succeed or fail can sometimes not be so easily abstracted by a rules book.
mhm,
And now, in some occasions, or probably most occasions, if you're playing a war game and you do something that is out of hat, right? Like you do something that is like unusual as your strategy.
mhm,
Maybe there isn't anything on the books, but maybe you and the other player, your opponent, can agree that that is a good idea, or maybe you can be convinced that that is a bad move, right?
mhm,
Like, oh, well, my positioning is going to put me on top of a hill. And it's like, yeah, but if you actually know the time that this battle took place, that would put the sun in all of your musketeers' eyes or whatever, right? Like you might
Yeah.
be able to be like, "Oh, I move my army here," and it's like, "I think this is a good idea," and they're like, "That is actually really disadvantageous," right?
Mhm,
And then you can kind of work out how the battle continues from there because of your positioning.
mhm,
Well, if you don't agree, you fundamentally disagree on the advantageousness of, or sorry, the advantages of a particular move. Having a third person there, a referee who ultimately decides, is kind of the origin of the DM. They're the
Yeah.
person who would call for the coin flip, or would you do the coin flip to decide initiative,
Mhm.
which is kind of the history of initiative, is who goes first was decided by like a coin toss.
I
And
love that.
as you add more players, there have been more like systems created for initiative.
Mhm,
The original like game of Dungeons and Dragons didn't have an initiative system. It actually just assumed that you would figure it out.
mhm.
Uh, well, because
Just
it
decide
also
on one.
well,
One.
because I mean, it was also like coming from wargaming, and so
Mhm.
it's like you probably already have a way from playing chainmail or whatever that you decided initiative, and so you can just do that,
Yeah, that's
right?
really
Like,
interesting. I love it.
um, and well, also because there's sometimes there's different rules of like, oh, in initiative what options go first. It's like, oh well,
Mhm,
the 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 melee characters go first, and then the artillery goes next, and then the spellcasters go next. Like there's a lot
mhm.
of different ways of doing initiative, right? Like
For sure.
to this day there's like a dozen different ways to do it.
There really is, it's confusing.
I am still partial to the coin flip, but that's a separate conversation. But the referee is there in order to be the person who decides who succeeds at a given action that isn't dictated by the rules explicitly.
Mhm.
Because if it's all dictated by the rules, then you wouldn't need a referee there because the rules
Yeah.
would be absolute. But you have a referee there in order to decide when the rules are not clear what happens.
I mean, that
And
even
that,
comes to sports as well with referees too.
yeah, no,
It's the same
100%.
way.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like, well, who decides what the rules are when the rules are unclear?
Mhm.
It's this person, and that is sort of the progenitor of the DM as a role in tabletop games. Is they're the person who is in charge of being the referee of the game. So your job is to be sort of an impartial rules arbiter who's
Mhm.
fair, but also keeps the game together and moving forward.
Which can sound like a lot.
Yeah, but what it ultimately means is like in a practical sense is if you guys don't know the rules, don't argue about the rules.
Mhm.
You have a referee. It's their
Yeah.
job to make the call. And sometimes referees make bad calls. I'm sure any sports fan will tell you that a dozen examples of a referee making a call that they disagreed with.
Mhm.
But there's a reason why there's someone there making the call is because it needs to move forward. So we need a
Exactly.
call right now. Now, in an ideal world, and like philosophically, I guess, you want as the referee to be as impartial as you can be.
Mhm.
And that can be difficult. But I
Yes.
think that err on the side of like what is fun and what keeps things moving forward. Um, I think that playing that role, it does require some note taking,
Mhm.
right? Like it's like, oh, I last time that we encountered this issue, I said this, right?
Yes.
And some awareness of the rules is required.
Mhm.
But I think more than the rules, your job is there to sort of enforce the social contract where everybody feels that the game is fair and that we're all here as a respectful group of individuals that want to play a game that is group storytelling. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, no,
yeah, so
I love that. I think that's also one of the most important roles too, and something that people might not realize when looking to play as the role of the game master. You know, the fact that they have to be that neutral party, they have to be that arbiter, they have to be the referee. They have to make sure that they solve conflicts, they need to make those fast rulings, they need to keep things going. That can be
and
something that you completely miss.
And I think that that can be something that people are scared of as well, is
Mhm.
of making a call that is a bad call, and that then they might backpedal, and this can open you up to players that are, let's say, let's say players that are highly opinionated or very strong willed might try to leverage your insecurities to their
Mhm.
advantage. And I think that as the GM of your game, you do have to put the master into that title.
Mhm.
And when you make a call, you have to stand by that that is your decision
Yep.
for now. And if we want to discuss the rules, we can figure that out after the game is over. We can talk about it later and sort of discuss what what the rule ought to have been. But it's like in the moment, in order to keep the game moving forward, you need to just make a call and move forward, because otherwise you can play a game that will last hours longer than intended. It'll be less fun for everyone there. You can't be arguing with the referee more
Mhm.
than maybe like a polite raise your hand and say, hey, I isn't the rule this. And if the
Yeah.
referee at that moment is like, I'm not sure, but for right now I think this is right,
Mhm.
go with that. And then you have to go with whatever the referee says, because that's their job. Their job is to keep things moving forward. And sometimes extenuating circumstances mean that you have to, you know, bend the rules or ignore them entirely, because sometimes the rules can't.
Mhm.
They can't cover every possible scenario.
And you're allowed to change them if it makes for a more fun experience on your end too, which I think
Mhm,
is the best part of these games. You know, you can play there are thousands of games out there and you can play any one that you want and you can change it any way that you want and it's
mhm.
fantastic. But I think it is like you were saying, I think it is important to have that confidence when you're taking on that role. Have that confidence and make those rulings, because I very much have a strongly opinionated player. And
Hmm.
there have been quite a few times where I mean, I'm a decent like I'm pretty good at taking on that referee role. I'm pretty good at like, yeah, this is the decision that's going to be made and we're going to go forward. But there's a few times where I have like just we were stuck on it for a little bit and we were having conversation, and I've learned from that where it's like, no, we just need to keep going, because it doesn't do anything for anyone else. You know,
Hmm.
us talking about the rules and exactly how one thing is ruled and all of that in a small combat that we just want to get out of the way, and so that we
Hmm.
can continue playing the game. That's we just need to rule something and continue, because it doesn't do anything for anyone. It doesn't do anything for even the person who's arguing about the rule, unless they're just trying to
Yeah.
do something specific. But even then, that's where you can even ask, what are you trying to do, and make a ruling as close as you can. Like that's where you
Yeah.
can start being more collaborative and asking even what they think, because as the referee, at least in a lot of these games, I feel like you don't have to you're the one who makes the final decision, but you don't have to come up with all of the ideas to rule something. You can
Yeah.
ask
And
the other players.
well, yeah, and that I think is really where the benefits of a tabletop game over just playing a video game do come from, is
Hmm.
that if you have an idea as a player and you're like, hey, can I, can I find something nearby that I can throw into the button, right? Like you need to
Hmm.
push a button across the room and you're like, can I find something in the room that I can throw? It's like, well, maybe on your map there isn't anything.
Hmm.
But the question then for the referee is, would it be reasonable that there is something in the room?
Yes,
If
I
it
love that.
seems reasonable to the DM that there would be something, a piece of debris, a rock, an onion, I don't know what it is, but
An
like
onion.
whatever it is, right? There's just a barrel of onions in the corner,
Oh yeah, for
whatever.
sure. Yeah.
But whatever seems reasonable that would be there, it doesn't exist as per the rules, right? Quote
Hmm.
unquote, the rules, because like you have a map in front of you. The map that you drew out doesn't have anything there to throw. So you
Hmm.
could very reasonably say no. But I think as the referee, your job in that scenario is to say, I think it would be reasonable that there are pieces of rubble and debris on the floor. You pick up one of those and you throw it at the button. Go ahead and roll to attack or whatever. Like that
Yeah.
is the sort of thing that can exist in a tabletop game that a game designer for a video game would have to explicitly have placed debris and stuff there in order to solve
Hmm.
this problem, where the problem of pushing a button that is too far away can be solved in a tabletop game in potentially limitless numbers of ways, ways that the DM didn't even plan for.
Which I
Um,
think is always the best part, when a
yeah,
player comes in and is like, I want to do this wild idea. And then as the GM, I'm like, all right, yeah, how can we do this? What
yeah,
makes
like
sense?
I came in with weirdly confident energy to one game that I was a player, and I was like, my character wants to climb the social hierarchy. Who
Mhm.
is the leader of this city, and what is like the org chart of this city? Like who is in charge? Who are their subordinates? Who's below them? Because what I want to do is
I'm
climb the ranks
obsessed.
level by level, right? Like I'll become the
Uh-huh.
bodyguard of some merchant if that merchant has access to a landowner, and then I'll become one of their employees and I'll just try to work my way up to the king. Like how do
That's
I do
so
that?
good.
Like and that being said, like that is a goal that I know from, later on that the DM at the time had no plans for. Obviously, they didn't
Hmm.
think that that was the direction this game was going to go,
Hmm.
but it was the direction that I wanted to go. And I mean, to be fair, I didn't like derail the entire game forever in order to do my thing that I wanted to do. But the DM
Hmm.
was willing to work with me on that, to be like, oh, yeah, you actually know somebody who is currently working for this powerful lord, and maybe you can leverage that to like get into a room with them.
I love that. And that's what I think is really cool is when people have those really hyper specific player goals. Like, this is what I want to do with my character and I want to reach this point. I think the most important part, though, is for the players to push those goals as much as the GM does. Like, the
Yeah.
GM shouldn't set up every situation for you to be able to reach those goals. If you're like, hey, I want to climb the social ladder of this city, but then you do nothing to do that and you're just waiting for the GM to present those opportunities, then that's a lot of work
Yeah.
for the GM
Well,
to do.
and on the topic of being the referee, what also would have been 100% fair for the DM to say to me in that scenario is, you're a foreigner in a very distant land. You don't know anybody here, so you don't know.
Mhm.
And could have just left it off at that, and then I would have to poke and prod at people in that I meet and have
Yes.
to learn that information. Now, he was kind enough and also experienced enough of a DM to kind of on the fly have some of that information and improvise the rest.
Mhm.
But it also is completely fair as the referee to look down at your notes and be like, I have nothing for this, and be like, you can't do that right now.
Yeah.
Like,
And that's fair too. And that's where,
yeah.
like, it doesn't, like, in those situations, if that was the ruling, like, yeah, you don't know anything right now. If that player wants to pursue that enough, they will do it. And
Yeah, they're
then
gonna ask again. Like,
exactly. And then as the GM, then. And then so you can prep for that and you can at least have ideas for that. So then you can push this story that they want to follow forward, but the player is still being an active pusher as well. I love it.
yeah. I think a good example of that is in one of my earlier campaigns, we had a wizard, and the wizard wanted a spell book, right? Like he wanted other spells to pick up for his class.
Mhm.
And so he kept on asking, right? Like he kept on being like, are there any spell books, or are there any like libraries or locations where people would be storing that sort of thing? And he kept on asking about it. And what was great about that is because I didn't have that information the first time he asked, but by the
Mhm.
third time he asked, I knew where to direct him,
Yeah, like I know
right?
exactly what
Because
I have for you right now.
yeah, because at that point it was like, oh, is there anything like this? And I could be like, this time there actually is.
Hmm.
Because I know that this is clearly something that you want. You've brought it up on more than one occasion. There's a
Yep.
lot of stuff to manage potentially as a DM.
Yeah,
And so, keeping those reminders and being an active part of it makes your job as the rules arbiter and also the creator of this world a little bit easier.
for sure. I love
Um,
that a lot. It does help just kind of have a direction of where to go, and you can even do fun things even if it's not exactly what that person is looking for. You can have things that relate to it that might
yeah.
even put them in a different direction, like, oh, this is actually maybe more interesting than getting the spell book. Like,
Hmm.
there are really fun things that you can do in that situation. But I think it might be time to go to the world, being
Right.
the world
The
builder.
So I would separate it into being the referee and being the puzzle master.
Mm.
And I'm going to define what I mean by puzzle master, because I think that this really actually defines everything else that you do as a DM. Literally, I think it covers it all. But what I mean by that is that when you're creating a world or populating a dungeon or designing any conflict, what you're really doing is you're stepping into the role of a puzzle master, which is somebody who creates puzzles for other people to solve.
Hmm. I love it.
And I think in some sense, and I heard this as a really good example from a video once about the game Hangman.
Hmm.
Actually, but they described Hangman how it is similar to being a dungeon master, and so I'm going to reverse that analogy and say it now like it's my idea. Um, but essentially, what I mean by that is that as the GM of a game, you are essentially the person in a game of Hangman who decides on what the word is,
Yeah.
and you can make that word as difficult to guess or as easy to guess as you'd like, but you do have to kind of walk a line where, as the person deciding the word, the decider,
Hmm.
you want your guesser to win.
Hmm.
And if your guesser loses, you want your guesser to feel like they could have won,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have to set your challenge as so it is difficult but not impossible. And it feels challenging, but the guesser will probably win,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you don't want to create a puzzle that is impossible for your players to solve, but you also don't want it to be so easy that it feels trivial
Yeah,
because you
it's
want to give it some sort of meaning.
yeah. No, I like that a lot actually. Because
Um,
you want your players to win.
Yeah, well, and also in the same vein as a game of Hangman, as the decider, you could say it is a one-letter word and just change it in your head whenever they make a guess. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can guarantee that they lose,
Yep.
right? But that's not a fun or fair game.
No,
And
it's
so
not.
that is where I think the analogy lines up beautifully is that as the GM, if you wanted your players to lose, they will lose.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not your goal. Your goal is to create a puzzle. Essentially, monsters in a game of D&D are just a puzzle that needs to be solved.
Mm-hmm.
Any trap is a puzzle. Any scenario you've come up with. Oh, there is an ancient necromancer in a long lost jungle in a temple somewhere, and they have, caused a death plague that is going to cause everybody's souls to be eaten by a like proto god.
Oh my
Like
god,
if
is
they're
that right?
doing that, so if they're doing that, right? Like that is essentially a puzzle. It
Yeah.
is a problem that you have presented for your players and they need to solve it. And the way that they solve it is maybe more complicated than a simple puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
but it is just a puzzle. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we solve this thing? One of my players has actually gotten into the habit of saying, anytime that they defeat something or they survive another session in my game, he's like, we have beaten your door puzzle.
Oh yeah.
We've defeated your Umber Hulk puzzle. And I do love that because it actually does sort of reinforce the dynamic that we have, which is that I've presented a scenario that was designed for you to solve. And if you
Yeah.
solved it, then we all win. Like as a puzzle master, you want the person to get the answer right.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you need to give them some hints and some help to help them solve the puzzle, but the goal isn't to stump people because if you can make a riddle that is impossible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you want people to solve your riddle, or if they fail at solving it when you tell them the answer, you want them to be like, "Oh my god, that was so doable."
I
Right?
should have known. Yeah, no, I I just have to say very quick, I really like the perspective of it being a puzzle master. Like I'm going through scenarios in my head and I'm thinking of games that I've played and I'm thinking of it more in the perspective of a puzzle. And I that is fantastic actually.
Thank you. I think that there is pretty much every piece of being a GM for any game can be put into that lens as like what your job is.
Hmm.
Right? Like, because your job is in one part to be the referee, to be the impartial rules arbiter, and on the
Hmm.
other side, to be the puzzle master, the person who created the world that is just a setting for your puzzles.
Hmm.
Right, like you created a village, and the village is in peril from there's a hag nearby that is summoning wicked things, whatever. Like that is the puzzle,
Hmm.
but all of the story elements, everything else, just lives in service to the puzzle. You
Really,
know,
it really does, yeah. Because any NPCs or anything in the world that you then portray, that's just the puzzle. Like you are just filling in the elements of the puzzle and everything that makes up the bigger thing that you're trying to
mhm.
figure out.
Well, and I think that that can also, as far as people who are starting off as a GM, like fresh off, I think that can kind of guide you on what is important to prep.
Hmm.
Because the things that you need to prep are the things that move your players towards solving your puzzle.
Ooh, I like that. Actually, I'm curious on what is your experience with prepping and what's your kind of, I guess, ritual when it comes to prep? Since I think that's a really good thing for beginner GMs or even GMs in general to hear different perspectives of how people structure the prep of their games.
I think Generally, okay, if the ball is already rolling and I already
Mhm.
have a
Hey, all, it is time for the midpoint of the episode, which means it is time to take a stretch, get some water, get some food, and then we will come back in a little bit to Zakariah talking about how he preps in his process, which as a GM, I find to be absolutely fascinating to listen to other game masters describe their process because it always makes me think of ways that I can improve my own. So it's an awesome time. Now, if you have been listening to this episode and you have been enjoying it, please make sure to leave a review for the RPG Goblin anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. Having reviews and seeing the support you guys give to the podcast really helps this thing keep going. I really want to pursue kind of making a what I like to call the TTRPG empire, where I just want to be a TTRPG content creator. I want to talk about these games. I want people to play these games, and I just want to make it my world. And anytime that you give support to the podcast or to the YouTube channel or anything like that helps make that dream come true. Which also, by the way, part of that dream is the RPG Goblin Discord server is up. It's been up for a few weeks now, and if you want an awesome place to come hang out and talk about TTRPGs, that is the place to be. All of my guests are in this Discord server along with a bunch of other really awesome folks, and if you just want TTRPG recommendations, what games you should play, things like that, we got you. If you are looking for groups to play with that are open for trying out different games, it is there. We have channels for it. If you just want to share your cool TTRPG stories and art and stuff like that, we have places for that too. And one of my favorite things is the RPG Goblin Library, which is a channel dedicated for sharing the links of where to buy every single TTRPG that we have had on this show: Castles and Crusades, Monster of the Week, Electric Bastionland, all of that, along with links to the actual guests all in one place. I know when I first got into the hobby, I really struggled with finding where to buy these games. So a big thing that I wanted to do with this Discord is to make a master library of where you can just get them. You can find the games, you can find where they are available, and buy them right there. It just makes life so much easier. So please make sure to join the Discord server, which the link will be in my link tree in the description of this episode. It is also on the link trees that are on all of my social medias, and I also post the link to it occasionally on Twitter, so look out for that, and please come join the community. We'd love to have you. Now, for today's midpoint, we don't have a promo, but I will talk about the next episode that will be coming out on the RPG Goblin, which will be November 10th. And this game is this episode's gonna be about a game called Sagas, which is a game coming to Kickstarter in January. And it is a genre and setting neutral game, such as Fate Accelerated, Cypher, things like that. So if you enjoy those types of games where you can use the same rule set for whatever story you want, this is one of those games. And may I say, it is a really, really cool game. I bring on the creator, Dennis, who is an absolute joy to talk to. So even if you don't like system generic games, I can't even recommend it enough to just listen to the fun conversations that we have. And so that is going to be coming out November 10th. And again, it's going to be about sagas, where it is a genre and setting neutral game, which is really exciting. One little spoiler I will give you is that we talk about a post-apocalyptic Pokemon game in that episode, which is really, really cool. So, yeah. Now, if you are ready to get back into the episode, which I know I am, and listen to Zakariah's process of prepping his games, then let's get into it. Structure the prep of their games.
I think generally, if the ball is already rolling and I already have a longer form thing going, it's a lot easier. But I think that as far as getting started, like a good place to start is to set up one encounter. Is I basically start at the end. I'm like, what is the big problem that needs to be solved? I actually did this recently on a thing that is now on DMsGuild, actually. Self-plug. It's Random Encounters 4, and it's called The Ballad of Auntie Egerton. And essentially, the way that it's like a mini module,
Hmm.
but the way that it's set up is essentially we start off with the biggest problem.
Hmm.
And in this case, it's anti-Egerton exists. Anti-Egerton is this like wicked green hag that is a problem, right?
Hmm.
So I describe the villain, I say what their backstory is. Basically, you come up with a reason why this element needs to be stopped, right?
Hmm.
Like, what are they doing? And then you can take Anti-Egerton and be like, okay, I have an encounter. I have a green hag. I have, she can summon these like green flame skull things. And it's
Hmm.
like, okay, those are some subordinates. I built her little like dungeon, which is actually just like this grove out in the woods. And then her house is in the middle of it. And so I'm like, okay, so we have like a dungeon. And so I
Hmm.
have this thing, and it's like, well, what are the things that she does? Well, she likes to like kidnap and eat children.
Oh,
So
naturally, yeah.
yeah, so it's like, okay, well, maybe there's a nearby village, and this is how I would handle it building out a larger adventure. I'd be like, okay, in a nearby village, some children have gone missing,
Hmm.
and they need to know where their children have gone. So I have a problem, and I have the cause of that problem. So that
Hmm.
is where I would start. Next, I would create a couple of other encounters on the way, because on the way to get to Anti-Egerton, what are the other things that I want you to encounter?
And would you say
Maybe,
these are just smaller problems then?
yeah, they are.
Huh,
They're smaller puzzles on the way to the main puzzle.
I love it.
And so it's like, well, on the way to Anti-Egerton, maybe you could encounter some enchanted wolves that are under her command, that are, that have been sent to, like, they're just like guard dogs in the area around
Hmm.
her grove. So that's one thing that might be there. And then maybe we have like a more fun encounter, maybe something that's more positive and extra puzzly. Like maybe in the tavern that you first hear about this, you encounter a satyr who is in the corner of the room who can give you information about Anti-Egerton in exchange for a game of some sort, like some sort of riddle game.
I love that. And that's the thing as well, is not all encounters have to be like
Combat. Yeah.
combat or deadly or anything like that. It's just something you have to overcome. It's an obstacle.
Yeah, it's an obstacle. Yeah. And also in the realm of tabletop RPGs, something like that I would say is also kind of optional, right? Like it's,
Hmm.
oh, you can say like, oh, people say that the satyr is a fae and the hag is a fae, so perhaps he knows something, and then you're
Yeah.
guided to go learn that. Where do you get that information from? Is something like, oh, there's a satyr in town who knows things about Anti-Egerton who might be able to help. That sort of thing is a piece of information that I would have in my notes, and I would just have that separate from any character or NPC in the game. It's like, it doesn't matter if my party goes to the tavern first or they go to the store. If they go to the store and they meet the store like shopkeep named Tularu and they talk to him, Tularu is going to tell them, hey, I've heard about this like, satyr that's in town.
Yeah.
Though you know that satyrs are fae, and satyrs as a fae, he might know something about Anti-Egerton.
Hmm.
Or if they go to the tavern, the barkeep is going to say, hey, I've heard of this satyr that's in town, right? Like they're going to say the same information because that information is a hint. It is a
Yeah.
hint for your players to solve your next puzzle.
It's important
Um,
information, and so it's
yeah.
gonna lead them in that direction, but that doesn't mean they have to automatically follow in that direction.
Mhm.
That's just
Yeah.
the direction that's gonna advance the plot. It's almost like any
Absolutely.
video game when you can do
Yeah.
side quests versus following the actual plot.
Well, but here's how I would say is like, okay, the overall problem is Anti-Egerton, right? And they're like,
Mhm.
I don't really want to deal with a satyr. Okay, I'm gonna
Mhm.
leave. They all just leave the town, and it's like, okay, well, what direction are you going in? How do you decide where to look? How would you
Mhm.
know where to find Anti-Egerton's place? And maybe they're like, hey, like maybe they don't want to ask around town. That would be a place where your players might come up with some fun and innovative way to find it. I think a good example of that might be, you know, hey, can we talk to the parents of one of the children? Maybe they have something of theirs.
Ooh.
Maybe they have like a lock of hair that is their kid's hair, and we can use that to cast a scrying spell. And then we can
That's
scry on the location of their child, and we can kind of use that to figure out like where is their kid now, where were
Mhm.
they taken, that sort of thing. Maybe they have other spells or other ideas of how, maybe you have a ranger in your party and the ranger's like, well, if they came by this part of the village and they went towards the woods, they have to have left tracks or something behind. Maybe
Yes.
I can follow that. It's like, oh, well, here's some footprints that are flanked by two wolves. That's suspicious. Maybe I should
Love it.
follow those. Like, your players will come up with a ton of potential solutions that may not have anything to do with the satyr that you set up as a hint to point them
Mhm.
in the right direction,
The hint's
right?
just there if they need it.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, they get stumped, they get lost in the woods. You roll on your woods table, and it says, they are lost in the woods for 4 additional hours, and they find themselves back at the entrance of the woods. And
Mhm.
it's like, well, this isn't going anywhere. Maybe we should go talk to the satyr. Or maybe they don't get lost, and maybe they just find the hut and they just skip the satyr altogether. That's fine
Mhm.
too. But what I would say is when I'm preparing a session is that is kind of how I do it, is I present a series of problems for which I don't know the solution.
Yeah, because you won't
Like,
know the solution until you play. That's the whole
yeah,
reason you're playing.
exactly. Like I have, obviously, off the top of my head, I have a few potential solutions in mind and I have a
Mhm.
hint to point them in the right direction, but I can't guarantee that they'll bite onto my hint, and I also can't guarantee that, they won't find a better solution to the puzzle than I've come up with.
Yeah, and something that's
Um,
also more fun for them too.
Yeah, absolutely. That maybe has more to do with their character, or maybe, I mean, this is honestly why, like, while I have an awareness of what my players' abilities are, I don't go like super hard on like knowing what everyone's abilities and spells and stuff that they've picked is, because
Mhm.
I do like being surprised by potential solutions that I didn't think about. It's
Mhm.
like, oh, you can do that? Like, you have that power as a wizard? Or it's like, oh, your cleric used their backstory as an acolyte in order to seek refuge in a church, because they're like, oh,
Love it.
well, I have the ability to know somebody in whatever form of clergy, and they'll let me stay there. That's part of my like background element. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, that is something that I may not have thought of, but maybe that is the perfect refuge from a vampire or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
these are things. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're doing a collaborative game. But I think that, yeah, essentially, as the puzzle master, creating the world, populating it with challenges, that is fundamentally the way that I frame my prep work, because
Mhm.
I don't need to over prepare a bunch of NPCs and figure out what information they know.
Yeah, because
Um,
that's just a lot of work. And
well, and
even
also
though,
it doesn't help. It's not
yeah,
helpful either, because I can have 100 NPCs in a village that all know no information relevant to the current anti-Egerton plotline.
yeah, you just have a few important ones. And especially in a situation where the players can just sidestep all of that and go on their own route to try and figure out the
Hmm.
puzzle, that I think kind of creates th- that creates the idea that, oh man, the DM did all this prep work and then like my players just ignored it. Like it kind of creates a little bit of tension even
Yeah.
there. Like if you over prep so much to the point that that it's too much, and when you feel like any point that a player doesn't pursue any of the stuff that you prepped and you feel kind of betrayed by that, you might need to relook at how you are prepping your games, because
Yeah.
that's not how these games are played, because there's
Well,
so many
yeah,
different
because
ways that people can approach these problems.
there's also only so much time in a given session, and I
Mhm.
am like a super time conscious DM, because, like, again, as part of the like social contract, I feel like it is my role to like keep the game moving and make sure that, we are all, for my games, we're all a group of adults that this is our Saturday,
Mhm.
right? Like, we have chosen to take our free time to get together to play this game. We could be doing anything else.
Mhm.
So this should be a fun experience that continues to that is engaging throughout. And so I
Yep.
think that being conscious of time is also important when you're planning. And that's why I would say you only need to prepare. If you prepare 3 encounters for a one shot, you will get through 1 to 2 of those.
Hmm.
Like, like if I was running the anti-Egerton scenario as a one shot, there wouldn't be any wolves in the forest.
Hmm.
And there probably would be a lot fewer things in her grove,
Yeah.
right? Because her grove is at least a session's worth of stuff
Hmm.
before you get to her house.
Yeah, basically
Um,
just streamline it.
yeah, at that point, you just streamline it straight to like, okay, and you go into the woods and you just see this large, like, grove like fence, and you enter it, and inside there's a hut.
Hmm.
And there's the hut, and then you go and you deal with Auntie Egerton in her hut. Also, that's another thing is like in the notes for the module, it's like, oh, Auntie Egerton might be out. Like she may not be home
Hmm.
at the time, right? So it's like, well, if she isn't home, then that means that the players get to like poke around her hut and, examine her things and maybe come up with a battle plan, maybe ambush her, all of this stuff.
Yep.
Where it's like, if you don't have that time, you put her in the hut.
Yeah,
It's
you make
just
it
you
quick.
walk in and she's there. um,
Especially
and
if combat takes time too, you want to make
yeah.
sure to get to that.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the consciousness of time and how much time you have to fill. But like
Mhm.
as far as you know, like how many encounters you need to plan or how many NPCs you need to generate, like I have a list of names in front of me that are first and last names that like my players can talk to anybody in the village, any rando person, and
Mhm.
I have a first name and a last name for them, and the information that they have will be guiding them towards the relevant next plot point.
Yep.
Because the NPCs don't exist to be fleshed out characters. They
Mhm.
exist as part of a puzzle. They
Yes.
can become more fleshed out characters, but they don't start off that way. That's not the point.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And that's actually something when I read the Monster of the Week rulebook that kind of made me realize that's the role of NPCs.
Mhm.
Because the whole thing is that you give them basically a role. Like this person's a victim and they get themselves like they get into trouble. This person
Mhm.
is an official and they are here to question what you're doing. Like it's basically here's the roles that this NPC provides, this location provides, this monster provides, and it simplifies that entire part of the game for you. So it's like, okay, I know I need someone who experienced something to basically give information. Probably a victim who got into who
Mhm.
maybe got attacked by this werewolf, and then that victim will have information on the werewolf and will help push the story forward of giving more information to the werewolf and
Yeah.
possibly where it may go next. And
Yeah.
so, no, I love that. And I love that you said that because I think that's a difficult thing for starting GMs to realize. Because, at least for me, I've been GMing for maybe about over a year and a half now, getting close
Mhm.
to 2 years. So I'm still very much new. There are so many things I'm still learning.
Mhm.
And especially when I started, I did not really understand how to use NPCs. I didn't know they were just supposed to provide a role in the story. And so when
Yeah.
I made NPCs, I kind of overcomplicated it for myself.
Yeah.
And then when an NPC showed up, I freaked out, even though I did the right thing, which was just name them and provide information for them.
Well, I think that's also a good point to bring up as far as like somebody who's newer to GM and getting started is because I think that this is a pitfall a lot of people fall into as far as prep
Mhm.
is simple is better, and that
Yep.
the simplest plot line, the most cliched plot line, is going to serve you better as a puzzle master than making something that is complicated, convoluted, or full of like, a like House of Cards level of politics. Like,
Yes.
I think that is something I've seen it on a couple of occasions personally, and I've heard about so many more where the DM has this very intricate storyline that they're disappointed that the players either don't engage with the way that they intended them to, or they never get to all of the information, and then the GM feels the need to like info dump on the players because they're very excited about this thing that they created, and the players are never going to encounter it in a D&D session.
Yeah, which is frustrating.
Yeah. It is frustrating, but I think that it's like a self-inflicted wound, because like the problem is that you're doing too much work. You're doing
really
the
are.
work of a novelist, and you aren't a novelist. You're a puzzle master. You're
and you're not
writing
a
a
story.
book. Yeah, you're not writing a book. You're creating a game of Hangman. And I think that you need to like temper your expectations for how much you can cram into an individual puzzle, right? Like you can do long form storytelling in D&D. Obviously, there's a billion podcasts out there doing very great stories in D&D, but that story is, as the medium of D&D, that story can't be overly complicated at the outset. Even if it gets complicated down the road, it gets as complicated as a 3-story arc in Star Trek. Like Star Trek is super like talk and tech, and it definitely has like some convoluted parts to it, but if you actually take any individual episode, they're fairly simple if you summarize. Because it has to be, because it only has like 30 minutes, and 20 minutes of screen time is like 4 hours of D&D. Like you don't get a lot of story in a 4-hour period of a tabletop game. That isn't to say that there isn't any story. It's just the way you allot time to story is different, because in a TV show they don't have to stop and roll dice in order to make a decision. The decision's just made by the narrator. Right? I think that simple is better in the form of puzzle making is like one of the most important things to like learn as somebody who's new to GMing. Because if you make a puzzle that seems obvious to you, I guarantee you that there is a breakdown between when you explain it and the players hear it at understanding the puzzle. Right? Because you can say, oh, there are 3 pillars, and on each pillar it has 3 faces. The faces are of a whale, a snake, and a bird. And up on the wall there's a giant bird symbol. And they'll be like, I wonder if we have to like touch each bird, and they'll try touching each bird. And it's like, well, maybe we have to cast a spell at all the birds. And they're like, maybe what we need to do is actually cast a spell on all of the not bird symbols. And they'll go around doing that. And you're like sitting there like, I mean, if you just rotated each of them to like all face the bird direction, it would just work. Why are they not doing this? And it's like,
People
well, that seems
overcomplicate it for themselves.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's like a puzzle like that is like a literal puzzle. As simple as you can possibly make it. A puzzle for 3rd graders like is as complicated as you can go, because there is a breakdown in what you imagine versus what other people imagine when they hear information that's informed by a host of like life experience and context. And the puzzle always seems obvious to the person making it. So
you already know the solution. Plus, from a player's perspective, you're always going to assume that the GM has something more. Has created this entire situation that's going to be like really complicated and all of that. And so when you go into it and you hear the information, it's like, okay, what's the wildest way this can be that we can
well, because I once had a session and I'll never do this. I'll never let something go on this long again, but there was more than an hour that was spent on a single puzzle.
Oh no.
And that was particularly because one very stubborn player was like, no, we are not moving on until I figure this out.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the fact that everybody else was like, we're done, we're ready to move on. And I was like, at the time I was trying to do more of a sandbox game. I was like, you guys can spend however much time here as you want, or move on. But I fully didn't intend them to, because this was a thing that was on the map, but it wasn't serving a real purpose. In the narrative. It wasn't serving a purpose in the current larger scale puzzle. It was more of an aside. And now with experience, I know I should have just cut this out entirely.
Yeah.
right? Like it's a waste of time. It wouldn't have improved anyone's game because I don't think that they had a way at the time to get through it, because essentially the puzzle boiled down to a door that said that no living thing can pass through this door.
Oh, interesting.
It was a little bit more like finicky. There was a
Yeah.
rhyme involved, but it was like, but essentially, like the misunderstanding was like, could they do it? Like the assumption was, oh, this is here, so I have to be able to solve it with what I currently have, because
Mm,
and it's like, well, no, you couldn't, because like if you had an undead creature with you, it could walk through. Anything
yeah.
that wasn't alive could walk through.
Mhm,
Ghosts could walk through. You can't walk through because you're not dead.
mhm.
Um, but that is the sort of scenario where like this puzzle was unnecessary. It didn't serve
Yep.
anything. Like it wasn't serving the larger problems at hand.
It was just a
And
fun thing to add.
it was just at the time I thought, oh, this is just a fun like side puzzle, and if they get through the door by some means, then they get something special. They get some
Mhm,
sort of reward or magical whatever, right?
mhm.
But they couldn't do that, and that's because the puzzle itself was, I didn't have like a single solution in mind for it, and there wasn't a way to solve it. And I also should have at that point just broken out of quote unquote like character and just been like, I don't think that there's a way for you to solve this. It's not really relevant. We can move on.
Yeah, I've
Right? Like,
actually
because
I've had something similar, not to that extent, but I introduced basically they were breaking into this house and trying to retrieve a book, and when they got into this room where the book was, the room started to fill with water. Not at like a extreme like it wasn't doing it really fast, but it was starting to fill. So it was like a problem that was approaching. But everyone especially the one strongly opinionated player I have, took it as this is an immediate threat. We have to deal with this now. And so they kept trying to figure things out, and I was getting stressed. I'm like, hold on, hold on. Let's step away for a moment. This is not that much of an issue. I should have worded it better. I
yeah.
apologize, but yeah, this is not something that we need to spend that much time on. We can move on.
Well, and I think that that is sort of like that is like a blending, right? Like it's a merging of the referee versus the puzzle master role that
Hmm.
you have there, because like as the referee, you want the game to keep on moving, and
Yep.
also as the puzzle master, if you realize that the puzzle isn't really possible, or maybe you like you misspoke, you
Yep.
stated the puzzle incorrectly, it is your job to clarify
Yep.
in order for the game to continue forward fairly. And I think in my case, in my example of the door that no living thing could pass through, is I should have like I should have just clarified that, oh yes, that is in fact what the riddle is saying. Like
Hmm.
the riddle is saying that you cannot pass through if you're alive,
Yep.
and that way there would be no ambiguity, because the ambiguity in the way that it was phrased meant that they were trying to think of other out of the box solutions
Yep.
for something that had like a finite number of solutions. I mean, I guess they could have just tried like breaking down the door, like that also was an option. But
Just
anyway,
destroy the
hindsight is 2020.
destroy the puzzle, and then you beat it anyway. It
Yeah,
works.
yeah. I mean, it's like, oh, we just unload our biggest spells possible into the door. It's like it's a stone door. It's probably pretty tough, but I mean,
Yeah, I mean
stone can be
anything.
broken. So
Exactly, anything can be anything can be figured out with enough brute force.
yeah, and
Like,
with enough time for sure, right? Especially with since there was no time pressure, it's like, oh,
mhm.
all that you need to do is come back with a hammer and chisel, and this
Yeah,
problem will solve itself.
did that player ever end up getting a way to solve it?
Nope.
Oh,
No, they didn't. Ultimately, that ended up being like, okay, let's like wrap up the session, and then oh, I know what happened. And then COVID hit.
oh,
The game went on pause for like 6 months or so until we got set up with an online game, and then we decided to play a different game altogether. So I think that that
mhm.
puzzle actually killed that game.
That's so funny. Oh no.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, that was a misjudgment on my part, but I did learn a lesson from it, and
Yeah.
it was that like when you're creating these puzzles, like you also kind of need to know at what point like you give up on the puzzle,
Hmm.
right? Like when is the puzzle misstated, or when is it super unclear? When is a good time for you to just peel back the curtain and be like, hey, like I didn't really phrase this very well. This like limerick that I gave you guys to help solve this, um, clearly it wasn't clear enough about what it is, but there's, you know, no living thing can pass through this door. Like that's what it means. And we can move on, or you can find a way to like blow open the door or come back another day with a hammer
Hmm.
or,
Yeah.
you know, something like that.
Exactly. And
And that would have been a better use of our time and would have been a better memory than anything than figuring it out, quote unquote, and you know, finding a way to like, oh, kill my character, but then revivify them maybe on the other side of the door or something. I don't know what they could have. I don't know what they could have done.
I
Um,
mean, I think that's a good point though, even in the larger scale of the puzzle. Like the whole campaign itself, if you're running something long form, that is a
mhm.
puzzle. Like
Yeah,
that's
it
just
is.
a long running puzzle. And having that self-awareness of knowing when something has gone wrong and that wait, this isn't actually going to be fun for anyone, this is going to be a pain, things got messed up, is really
Mhm.
important. Because and also knowing that all of those are lessons. Like it's not
Yeah.
like, even if it may seem like failure, every single one of those is a lesson. Because I actually recently had to kill my first campaign
Hmm.
and it was painful, and that was mostly due to mistakes that I made early on and mistakes that I just never fixed because I thought it would be okay. And it led me to doing things that I didn't like to do until finally I told everyone, I'm like, hey, we need to talk because the way the story's going, I introduced way too many things. I made it way too complicated. Like you were saying earlier, it's easy
Hmm.
to overcomplicate something that you really
Oh yeah.
don't need it to be that much bigger than, oh, here's this simple plot line. Something's trying to take over the world. That's simple.
Hmm.
And I overcomplicated the entire thing. And then during play, I still brought in more elements, and things just kind of started to become a mess because there was so
Yeah.
much stuff that it couldn't feasibly fit within this game, and all
Yeah.
the elements couldn't fit together.
They all
And
couldn't
so
resolve themselves as one cohesive thing.
exactly. It would have
Yeah.
had to be kind of piecing it together slowly. And I'm like, I don't think this is going to be fun. It's not fun for me right now. It's not going to be
Yeah.
fun for you guys. And I
Yeah,
know that you're already having struggles.
I have absolutely I have made the mistake of trying to carry on a game past the point that it should have been over. Like
Hmm.
basically my party TPK'd by failing an encounter, and I, instead of ending the game, I was like, "Oh, well, your characters come to in like the afterlife plane," and we tried to continue it. And I really hated the vibe of it.
Hmm.
And it wasn't for me, and ultimately I ended up having to kill the game down the road because I was so unhappy with it, where I should have
Hmm.
just let it die naturally,
Hmm.
where it was like, oh yeah, no, the dragon actually just did sink your ship, and that kind of is the end of the story. We need to start a new one, and we can like reboot it, start over with the same characters
Yep.
if we want to, which is always an option as
Oh,
well.
for
You know,
sure.
it's like if your party TPKs, you can play the same character if you want to. They are dead in this universe, but there are a billion universes for them to be alive in. So if you fail
Exactly.
with a character on one attempt, just play them again another time, and maybe you'll have a better go at them this next time around. Like I know
Yeah.
some folks that have played the same character more than once, and I honestly I kind of love it because it's neat to see the same character in different scenarios and
Hmm.
different you know, places.
And with
But to
different casts too, like different casts of other
Oh
characters and
yeah,
how that
exactly.
will
Like
change.
sometimes characters don't fit in with the party that you built around them, and maybe
Hmm.
they just needed a different group,
Yep.
right? Like they just needed a different group of companions. Um, to what you
No,
were
I
saying
love that.
about like a simple is better, like long form campaign. Actually, during COVID-19, when we were all in lockdown and we were doing this online game, I
Mhm.
did what I think is kind of the best game I've ever run, as far as like a long term campaign, because it
Hmm.
went on for like 10 months.
Ooh, nice.
And um, actually, most of my campaigns are about like baby length. Like it's
Hmm.
usually about 9 months or so for a campaign.
I mean, okay,
Um,
to be honest, I understand the appeal of like campaigns that run for years. I do.
mhm.
But I think that campaigns that last less than a year are superior in the way of I feel like it can get dragged out too long if you make it like, oh, here's like 3 years we're playing a campaign. Unless you are keeping things interesting and people are able to switch things up, I feel like it just goes for
I,
so long.
I think you also might have to consider like the duration, the frequency at which you play
That is
also
also
factors in
true.
because I play regularly, like every week, and so I
Hmm.
think if you're playing a game weekly, you can get through a lot of ground. You can cover a lot of ground in 9 months. Right. Where I think if you're playing a game bi-weekly, that you don't cover as much ground. So maybe, I mean, that same game would take 18 months, right?
Hmm.
And the difference is just we play weekly versus, monthly. Like if you're playing a
Yeah.
game monthly, I totally understand it going on for years because like how much can you feasibly cover if
Hmm.
you're only playing once a month? Not
Yeah, and I
none of
can
these are
totally get.
better than others. I'm not saying playing more frequently is
Yeah.
better. I like it because I like things. I like playing. I like playing
Yeah,
the
it's
game.
all up to
But
personal preference, and I'm not saying that long-running campaigns are a bad thing by any means. And I do know
mhm.
that play, like how much you do play, does depend on it. But I know in the game that I actually killed, we played for over about a year and a half, and we played for 40 sessions. And we, again, this is mistakes in which I'm learning things from. So it was a great experience for that.
Yeah,
But
of course.
we played for about a year and a half, 40 sessions, and we barely got anything plot related done. And it
Yeah.
kills me to think about it when I'm like, oh, versus we're now doing this Monster of the Week game. We've had 11 sessions so far, and we've completed 2 arcs fully, and we're just introducing the next one. I'm like, wow,
Well,
things could actually go at a pace that
things
makes
can
sense.
happen.
Yeah, things can
Uh,
happen.
well, also, I think along that, what I was gonna say is that like as far as simple is better as
Oh,
like
yeah, I
a
didn't mean to
concept to.
interrupt you. Sorry.
Oh no, not at all. But as far as like simple is better on a long form campaign applies as well
Hmm.
because the best structured campaign that I've ever run was this online game. And the premise of the game was you all wash up ashore after your ship has crashed.
Hmm.
You are in a foreign land that you weren't traveling to. This isn't your intended destination, but
Hmm.
you've washed up in this land, and the entire plot centered around the fact that on a mountain in the distance there is a giant dragon named Bogvad, and
Ooh,
Bogvad is this dragon that is so massive. It's basically the entire mountaintop above the clouds is Bogvad. And he
that's
is
cool.
so powerful that the world below him, with all of these like little giant people, like that's contradictory, but they were essentially like Goliath type of giant people,
Hmm.
right? Like they've built their society under the threat of Bogvad to just like their entire industry is about feeding Bogvad. Like
Hmm.
they feed Bogvad, and Bogvad eats 1,000 people per day.
Oh, wow.
And that is like the villain of this story is Bogvad. The
That's
player
so cool.
characters, the player characters are given a magical item while they're on the beach. They meet a knoll that like gives them a magical rock and says, "My god says if you take this rock up to the top of the mountain, this stone will shoot a beam that will kill Bogvad and you'll save the
Ooh,
world. All you have to do is bring this to him."
I
And that is
love
the
it.
entire game. The
I
entire game
love
was
that.
everything that took place between them landing on the beach, being given this stone, and getting to the mountain was all just a series of smaller puzzles in order to move them forward. Along the way, they met different characters, they attended festivals, they had a period of time where they got captured by evil wizards. They learned a lot about the world on the travel, but the entire way there was just this through line of like, you have to get to the mountain. You
Hmm.
have to get to the mountain. So they knew no matter what they were doing, if they were being, captured by one of Bogvad's like smaller dragon lackeys, right? Like it's trying to thwart them in their journey to go kill Bogvad. Like all of that is in service to the fact of one very simple premise, which is get the rock to the mountain. You have to get to the top of the mountain. And ultimately, that was the entire game. And they got to
Hmm.
the top of the mountain, and the stone um, didn't actually kill Bogvad, but it made such a big noise that it summoned giants from across the sky, and those
Whoa.
giants kill Bogvad.
That's so
Um,
fun. Oh my
and
gosh.
and that is kind of the wrap up of the game then, right? Like there's like a sort of like relaxing of like the tensions afterwards because
Mhm.
Bogvad is dead, the Storm King has returned, all of this stuff. But but the premise was the simplest premise I've ever used, and it worked as well as any premise I've ever had before.
I'm
Because
obsessed with that.
well, because at the end of the day, like whatever shenanigans they were getting involved in, there was something that would come up that would be like, oh, also it framed every sub puzzle as well,
Mhm.
right? Because Bogvad is such a huge, intimidating force in this world and has impacted everything. So if they talk to these like Goliaths at their village, the Goliaths at one village are like, oh yeah, we're like, at war with like our cousins because they are part of this complex that feeds Bogvad thousands of people every day.
Mhm.
And they're like, and then you go to that city and they're like, we don't have a choice but to feed Bogvad every day, otherwise he'll destroy us. And you go to
Yeah.
the next location, it's like, oh, there's this orc subplot with this village of orcs. Well, the orcs are tired of being like you basically used as the feed for
Mhm.
Bogvad. Like they're the ones that are being sent away. And so you have this whole orc subplot. And but it all relates to Bogvad. The wizards
Yeah.
in the sky, they're like these sky castles with wizards in this world that ended up like capturing the party at some point. But every single wizard at like every single archmage, their goal is to transform into a dragon because they want to be like Bogvad.
It's just it's nailing in the point that
Mm-hmm.
this this is bad. Like it's
Yeah,
at every turn it is showing like this is an actual force of like this is an actual bad force that we're dealing with and here is how it's affecting the world around
yeah,
it and the
yeah.
people and you and all of, oh, I like that so much.
And I think because of that, it's like they couldn't escape it, right? Like there was
Uh-huh.
no like getting so distracted by shenanigans that they were like, oh, Bogvad, I forgot about him. Like they
Yeah, no,
can't
you
because
can't.
the orcs, it's about Bogvad. The
Mhm.
Goliaths, it's because of Bogvad. The freaking wizards, they're doing it because of Bogvad. And so having that, everything funnels towards the final puzzle, which is, you know, getting to the top of the mountain and all of the challenges that lie in the journey. um
That's so
and
good.
and
I
and
think
you
that is genius.
and you could kind of structure a game like Curse of Strahd in a similar fashion. Like
Mhm.
Strahd is such an impactful force on the world of Barovia, on the land of Barovia. Like you can't escape him. He is everywhere. He is the land. He will bother your party. He will
Mhm.
toy with you. And you can create this villain where it's like, oh, well, you're talking to these villagers, and it's like, oh, well, somebody recently passed away, and it's like, well, why did they pass away? It's because of Strahd. Like it
Yeah.
has something to do with him. And it's no different with Asirarak in the Tomb of Annihilation
Mhm.
module either, right? It's like nobody can ignore this problem because people are dying and their souls are being eaten.
Yeah.
And if you wait long enough, more people will continue to suffer from this plague that is only getting worse. And so even if you get into like a side story shenanigan chasing around like a magical chicken or whatever, like you can't be distracted for too long
Mhm.
because like, oh, anytime an animal is killed for like hunting for like food or whatever, that animal's soul gets consumed by the by this like evil curse
Mhm.
monster thing. So like you literally can't escape it for a moment.
And as the GM, you can just like even how you like describe those types of things and narrate those types of things too. You can push that idea even further. Like, yeah, you got distracted to kill this chicken, but then what happens when you kill that chicken that makes you remember why you're here?
Yeah, yeah, you see like a wisp of its soul like rising out of it and then vanish into like this eerie green vapor. And it's like, well, what was that? It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, that actually happens whenever anything dies right now. That's super weird, right? Like that's what your companion says is like, oh, that's super weird. That happens whenever anybody dies. And then the players remember, oh, I know what that means. That means
Mhm.
that the chicken just got its soul consumed, which is a
Oh no.
horrible fate. and maybe we need to do something about it. Maybe your druid starts to lose their mind a bit because of the implications of that, right? It's like circle of life is being disrupted because nothing gets to go to the afterlife. Like you could do so much with that, but I think that that's kind of the big thing about creating like an overarching villain, is that, you know, simple is better. You want to keep it simple, and then everything in your sub puzzles are related to that big puzzle, right? Like the big problem generates all of these smaller problems, and that'll keep you on track for like, it'll keep you on track as far as like what your smaller things should be, and if you might want to, you know, put a pin in certain ideas because those ideas are completely unrelated. Maybe they aren't going to lead your players towards the main attraction. So you'll want to bench those ideas. It's like if I had like in my current game, like, yeah, my players just encountered like a bunch of like drow in this drow city and whatnot, but I was very quick to try and get them out of it because that wasn't really the main storyline. It was like, we need to get you guys out of this city as quickly as possible and make sure that it is inhospitable for you to return, because the main plot is still happening elsewhere. You still have to deal with the Frost Maiden and this eternal winter up on the surface. People are going to continue suffering. And it's so easy to get distracted, especially if you make something that is particularly cool or feeds into the aesthetics of one of your players. Like they're going to want to go and do this thing, but it's like, well, everything there has to point back towards the plot in motion. Like one of the villains that my party recently dealt with, like they recently killed the guy, but he's still a problem because essentially the actions of this villain were allowed to go to such a point that it caused other problems, and those issues are still existing in the world. So even though the character of this ogre called Yataway Krogs, even though he's dead, the problems generated, the other sub puzzles still continue. In fact, bigger problems than him being dead are still around. Essentially, like his death like triggers a whole like element of grief where like some fae turns into like a frost maiden. Because this character like killed this fae's sister, and so because Yataway Krogs killed this fae's sister, the grieving fae has turned into this frost maiden that has plagued the land with winter.
I love that.
And that means that, you know, the problem at hand of like, oh, the problem was this one evil dude, like this one evil ogre. Even though that problem is solved, there's still bigger problems to solve. How do they get to the Frost Maiden? How do they talk to her or vanquish her or do something? Because while completely justified, the person that she's trying to take vengeance on is dead. Like, how do we get close enough in order to convince her to stop, or to just, you know, vanquish the evil from the land? Because maybe she's too far gone. She's fallen too deep into this hole of being evil, and we can't convince her otherwise. Like, whatever solution my players come up with is the solution to the puzzle. But that is the direction that they're going in, and everything is going to point them towards it because they have to go towards that thing.
Absolutely. I think that, again, this is great, especially coming from having to kill that campaign literally like a week ago, and just like that being very fresh in my mind, and still learning as a GM. This is all really, really helpful to hear. And like, even if it may be obvious when you hear it or when you say it, it kind of unlocks that part of your brain like, oh, wait, no, you're right. That is the role that I have. That is what I have to do in these stories to get the outcome that I want, which is to have a fun time with your friends telling a story where you complete a goal. Like, that's really kind of that's the whole thing around TTRPGs. You're having a fun time with your friends, playing this game, creating a story to complete a goal.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, that to like get back to the original like topic of this, which I don't feel like we've strayed too far off of.
We haven't strayed very far. Which
I think that in summary, sort of, is that the roles of the DM are as the impartial referee to adjudicate the rules and keep things moving forward, be fair, and a referee, right? As
Hmm.
well as being the puzzle master, which involves creating the world and populating that world with challenges. And that involves everything that you're doing. The puzzle master will want to create some simple challenges,
Hmm.
conceptually simple. And then every other puzzle that they make is in service to another puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And I think that as long as you keep those things in mind, it'll simplify your prep, because anything that you're preparing should be related to the puzzle. And it'll simplify you running the game, because your job as the referee is to maintain the social contract and keep the game moving, right? Like in the
Yep.
best interests of your players, who are everybody else, presumably your friends at the table. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that so much. And just you, and the thing is, what's great is that's the role of the GM. But that doesn't dictate the way that you play the game. That doesn't dictate
Mhm.
how like your play style or even your group's play style. These are just tools to help enhance all of that. And I think that is what's truly fantastic about what we've been talking about is yeah, this doesn't tell you any way to play your game.
Yeah.
Just like using these tools just helps you complete your goal.
Yeah, it's just there to help, like, frame what your job responsibilities are, right? Rather than, like, there's so many different styles and ways to play any of these games. One game to another will
Hmm.
change the way that you, like, emphasize what your game looks like, what prep you're doing, what your puzzles look like.
Yep.
Will change from game to game and from GM to GM. But I truly believe that this is like a very good condensed version of, these are your job responsibilities. Anything that's outside of that or adjacent to it can vary.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and this
absolutely.
is a sort of thing that you would carry from one game to another. If you're trying out a new game, you're still the referee, you're still the puzzle
Hmm.
master. Oh, we're all trying out a game for the first time. Well, my job is to be the referee. None of
Yep.
us know the rules, so ultimately it falls to me to, like, make the call and,
Yeah.
move the
Have a
game
basic
forward.
idea. Help guide
Yeah.
people through it. Like
Yeah.
it's just those basic things that I think you even if you don't really know the role of the GM and what you need for it, that you do end up falling
Yeah.
into these same roles, which is what's great too, is that even if no one knows at the start, eventually you'll get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone does, and you'll find the
Yeah.
way that
Yeah.
works for
And
you.
yeah, and I think that there's certainly a wealth of information that is passed down sort of as tribal knowledge, and I think that
Hmm.
there's, that, like, there isn't like a solid, like, codified single
Yep.
place to go for all of this advice. But that's sort of why, like, I try to keep that in mind as I, like, introduce new people to the game, is like, what are all of the things that I've learned over
Hmm.
my years of listening to other people talk about these games in this this space, and what are the things that I found useful, and what are the things that I thought were kind of counterproductive or
Hmm.
harmful to my game or the games of other people that I know,
Absolutely.
to sort of reinforce a positive gaming experience, in this space that we know and love. And
Yeah.
I think one last note on, like, the puzzle master thing,
Mhm.
when starting in a new game, is whatever new game you're playing, you can figure out what that puzzle is in very simple terms. For example, in the Warhammer 40K Wrath and Glory game, a very easy, like, puzzle, quote unquote, in the intro, like, box set is, you're a bunch of space marines on a ship, and you find out that the ship is occupied by orcs. Your
Mhm.
objective then becomes escaping the ship and blowing it up.
Mhm.
Like, all that you have to do, the entire puzzle, is escape the ship. And so, as the person running the game, you can go, okay, well, what challenges are between my players in exiting the ship? Well, they're
Mhm.
already at the bridge of the ship or whatever before they realize that it's orc infested. And so they're going to encounter, pick like 3 things that they will encounter on the way out of the ship. It's
Mhm.
like, well, on the way out of the ship, they have one encounter with actually just a bunch of orcs in a room. They have another encounter where they come into a hallway and it's completely collapsed, or maybe there's like some, you know, a fusion core or something that's going to explode, or the door lock on them, whatever thing is going to impede them. You come up with maybe 2 or 3 things on the way out of the ship. But once they get out of the ship, you know, their spaceship pulls away, it shoots its guns, it blows up the ship. The game is over, you've won.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that's your one shot. It's essentially figuring out what is the puzzle of this game.
Yeah.
And how do I facilitate that happening?
What are the obstacles to get there? I like that.
Yeah. And then the referee part is where you actually gloss over the rules, get an idea of how the gameplay loop works. But that is those 2 roles. Is like there's the functional, like this is how the game works mechanically, and here's how I judge success or failure. And then here are the challenges, and here's how we get you to succeed or fail at those challenges. Here's the puzzle. How do you solve it?
Yeah, the fun part.
Yeah,
the mechanics exactly. Are also fun, but
yeah.
But I think though there's kind of one thing I want to ask, but I think we're getting to the end here because we've covered a lot, and this has been fantastic. Again, thank you for like suggesting this as an idea, and thank you for coming on to do it, because this has opened my eyes on how I want to structure things, and I'm very excited to design my next one shot. Putting it more in perspective of puzzles. But
I'm excited to hear about it. It does help for bullet points as well. Is like, what are my things? I have 3 bullet points of 3 puzzles for this evening, and now I expand.
For sure, I love that. And so I'm just obsessed. And I've kind of done something similar with my prep of doing almost like a beginning, middle, end thing. And that's kind of where each of the obstacles will come in. Like, oh, here's an obstacle at the beginning, middle, end. And that ends up working. But I'd like to, again, try this out, because learning things from other GMs is a great way to learn everything. And so, but the last thing that I'd like to ask, other than the whole villain point, what is something a GM is not? Like, what is another role that the GM is not? What is a toxic or bad practice as a GM that you have come across and people might think is a good thing, but ultimately is not?
Other than the villain, which we talked about earlier, I don't think that the GM is the game's babysitter. I think that that's going to be like, I think if there was something that your job as the GM isn't to do everything. It isn't to keep the game together. It isn't to keep your friends from having arguments with one another. Like, this is sort of like stepping outside of the bounds of, actually, I guess it kind of answers your question then, right? Because it's like, this is beyond the bounds of being the DM. Your job as the GM of your game is not to be your player's parent. And I think that there are a lot of folks that when they step into the role of the GM, because it is sort of it is an authoritative role, right? Like, you are the one person who stands out at the table. You have a screen, probably. You have like this level of, you introduce the game, the scenario, all of this stuff. So it puts you in a position of quote unquote authority. And I think that defaults a lot of people to thinking that everything is your problem. And if 2 of your players aren't getting along, that isn't your fault. That isn't your problem as the GM. That's not your job. Your job isn't to resolve out of game conflicts between players. If there's an issue in the game that you can like adjudicate and resolve and referee within the game, that's one thing. But it's actually one of the things I introduce people to when I'm starting a game as part of a session 0 is I'm like, I am not your parent. If you have an issue with another player, you 2 need to, as respectful adults, just talk to each other. Like, and sort that out. Like, because the only thing that I can really do as the GM in an interpersonal conflict is be like, you're out of the game, right? Like, to one person or the other, that is the only actual quote unquote power I have in the scenario, is to kick somebody out of the game. So don't involve me. Right? Like, because I don't have any not only am I not your parent, but I'm also not your boss. I'm not
Mhm.
like in charge of making you get along. This is my Saturday too,
Yeah.
right? Like I chose to be here. I want to have a good time. I want to have fun. I shouldn't be spending my time mediating other people's
Mhm.
interpersonal conflicts. If those interpersonal conflicts means that one or both of you can't show up to the game, then we need to just like, cancel or reorganize or change
Talk about it.
something
Yeah,
else,
like, just
right?
communicate.
Yeah, but like it is not the role of the DM to deal with other people's real life problems.
Mhm.
That is something you can choose to do as a friend or as a family member or whatever,
Mhm.
but that is not your role as a GM.
Yeah.
And I think that is a danger that a lot of people fall into is they end up becoming the sort of pseudo parent of their D&D group, and that should not be your part in this at all.
Yeah, I can completely agree to that. And I think the only role that the GM could even play in that is if something happens in the game that is
Yeah.
caused by that. And then that's when you put down the line and you're like, okay, nope, like this is not, you can't do this. And we need to talk about the situation and see if there
Yeah.
needs to be something like you can't play, like you have to not play this game anymore, or
Yeah,
things
it's like
like that.
yeah, if an out of game conflict turns into two characters fighting in the game and it
Hmm.
has nothing to do with like cuz D&D is all about like it's all about consent, really,
Hmm.
right? Like when you have inter-character conflicts, it's like, oh,
Yep.
two players shouldn't ever be fighting, but two
Yep.
characters absolutely can. Your paladin and your rogue are going to go at it over one reason or another in your game. That's fine as long as the players both can step out of that and go like we're cool, right? Like, oh yeah, like we're totally
Yeah.
good. Like this is purely just character-based shenanigans.
Yep.
It's not actually having a fight at the table.
Hmm.
But if it gets to the point where characters are doing things because players are having issues and having a conniption with one another, that is the point where, yeah, if you recognize that as the GM, as the referee, you need to call a timeout.
Hmm.
Like that is the scenario where, as the referee, for the health of the game and the stability of the game, that's when you have to say, hey, this seems to be an actual like interpersonal issue. We're going to stop right now and we can take a few minutes. Maybe you guys need to talk, but for right now, the session is done.
Yep.
Like that is the point to call it.
I
And
agree
then
with that.
they need to sort that out themselves.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you don't need to lead like, "Hey," like, "Oh, you
Yeah.
need to talk to you," and whatever. No, it does need to be,
Yeah.
especially, like, most of the time you're playing with friends, but especially if you're
Yeah.
not, like, these are just
Yeah.
random strangers that you're playing with. That is not your responsibility. That has to be handled between them, and then it needs to be communicated back to the GM if things are okay or if there's still a problem, and that's, like,
Yeah.
really the only thing, and that's only, like you said, for the health of the game. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is the extent by which, as the GM, that I'm going to get involved in anybody's personal conflicts. Like,
mhm.
is just if I recognize that that's what's happening, I'm going to stop the game and it's not going to continue unless everybody involved can tell me that it's been resolved. And
Yep.
again, I don't need to be informed about any of that, any of the tit for tat. Oh, they did this in the game and that actually upset me IRL. Like, I don't care. I don't need to know, as the GM. Now, if I'm friends with these people as well, like being informed as part of a friend group and your dynamic and whatever, like that's all separate.
Mhm.
But I think again, it's sort of like it's compartmentalizing of like, as the GM of the game, there really is no place for me to be solving your personal problems.
Yeah.
Those are things for you to sort out on your own. You are a responsible individual, as we all are, and we just want to spend our Saturday playing D&D. Like we could be doing anything else other than this.
Mhm.
So if we want to do this, we all need to be here, be
Yep.
respectful to other people, and keep the
Everyone
social
play their
contract.
roles, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, be like, show up and do what you're supposed to do, and if you can't do it, then I'll come to an agreement that you do something else.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
that, though, is a great way to end this episode. Yeah, like, what are the roles of the GM? Who's the GM? Why? What? All of those things. I think this is if anything, is a good starting off point for people to just consider some ideas for how you, as the GM, what your role is there. It just opens up possibilities that you can start implementing into your games and see if they work for you. So I want to say thank you so much, Zakariah, for coming on and talking to me about this. This was absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to again plan my next one shots. And if you guys want to check out Zakariah and the awesome content that he makes, please make sure to go to DMsGuild and search Zakariah to find all of the awesome D&D 5th edition content that he has made, including that adventure with the hag, which I can't remember her name.
Oh, Auntie Egerton.
Auntie Egerton. Absolutely amazing. That sounds like a blast. And that link will also be in the description of this episode if you would like to check it out. But yeah, thank you so much, Zakariah, for coming on and talking about this.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Amazing. Yeah, so I think that is going to be the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And once again, thank you so much, Zakariah, for coming on. Greg.